The morning my grandmother's will was read, I made myself a cup of coffee first. Not because I was calm, because my hands needed something to do. I sat at the kitchen table in my grandmother's house, the house I'd been living in for 3 years, the house I'd been cleaning and maintaining and paying the property taxes on while my mother and my stepfather took vacations in Sedona, and I listened to my uncle read the document out loud. He wasn't a lawyer, he just liked the sound of his own voice. "The property at 4412 Cresthaven Road," he said, pausing the way people do when they want you to feel something before they say it, "is to be divided equally among all surviving family members." I set my coffee mug down. All surviving family members. That included my stepfather, a man my grandmother had met 11 times in her life. A man who, at her funeral 6 days earlier, had stood in the back of the church checking his phone. I want to back up, because this story doesn't start with the will. It starts about 4 years before that, when my mother married a man named Gerald. My mother and I had always been close, or I thought we had. After my father died when I was 19, it was the two of us for a long time. She worked as a dental hygienist. I was finishing college, working weekends at a restaurant, calling her every Sunday. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling. We were just two people holding things together in the ordinary way people do. Then she met Gerald at a church event. He had a firm handshake and a lot of opinions about real estate. Within 8 months, they were married. Within a year, I noticed that my Sunday calls with my mother had become shorter, then less frequent. Then she started saying things like Gerald thinks and Gerald feels, and I talked to Gerald about this and we both agree. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. But Gerald was the kind of man who made everything a transaction. He kept a mental ledger. He remembered every favor and every slight with equal precision, and he brought them up at the exact moment they'd do the most damage. When my grandmother, my father's mother, not my mother's, got her Alzheimer's diagnosis 3 years ago, I moved in to help her. I gave up my apartment in the city. I transferred to remote work. I spent my evenings doing her laundry, making sure she took her medication, driving her to appointments. My mother visited occasionally. Gerald visited once, stood in the doorway and said the house smelled like old people. My grandmother was sharp in some ways even when the disease was advancing. She knew who I was every single day until the last 3 weeks of her life. She also knew, though she never said it plainly, that certain members of our extended family had been absent. What I didn't know was that 8 months before she died, she called a lawyer. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The morning the will was read, my mother sat across from me at that kitchen table with her hands folded in her lap. Gerald sat beside her. He was wearing a polo shirt and he smelled like the kind of cologne that comes in a gift set. My uncle, my father's brother, Ray's age, a man who had also visited my grandmother exactly once in 3 years, kept reading. The house, the savings account, the small investment portfolio, all of it divided equally. My mother, my uncle, 2 cousins who lived in Phoenix and hadn't called in years, and Gerald. Gerald. "Wait," I said. My uncle looked up. "Gerald isn't a blood relative. He's not even. My grandmother barely knew him. How was he in this document?" My mother shifted in her chair. "We had her updated after we got married. It was just the right thing to do. Family is family." I looked at her for a long moment. "I took care of her for 3 years," I said. "I was here every day." "And we're grateful for that," Gerald said. He had this way of saying "we" that always made me feel like I was being addressed by a corporation. But gratitude isn't the same as legal entitlement. I stood up. I picked up my coffee. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard, my grandmother's garden, which I had watered every summer, the rose bushes she'd planted when my father was a boy, and I breathed. I did not try. I did not argue. I said, "Okay," in the flattest voice I could manage, and I left the room. What my mother didn't know, what Gerald definitely didn't know, was that my grandmother had called a lawyer 8 months before she died, and that lawyer had come to the house on a Tuesday afternoon I was at the grocery store. My grandmother had answered the door herself, which she could still do then. She'd sat at the same kitchen table, and she had signed a separate document. I found out 3 days after the will reading. Her attorney, not the family's attorney, her personal attorney, a woman named Miss Albright who had been handling my grandmother's private affairs for 15 years, called me on a Wednesday morning. Your grandmother executed a transfer on death deed for the property, she told me. Filed with the county 8 months ago. It names you as the sole beneficiary. The house transfers directly to you outside of probate. The will doesn't affect it. I sat down on the floor, right there in the hallway. Just sat down. She didn't tell me, I said. She wanted it to be clean, Miss Albright said. She told me she didn't want you to have to fight anyone. She wanted it done before there was anything to fight about. My grandmother had known. She had seen what was coming from further away than any of us, and she had done the one thing that protected me without requiring me to ask for it or argue for it or prove I deserved it. She had just quietly, legally made sure. I pressed my hand flat against the hallway floor for a moment. The wood was cool. It was the same floor I'd swept probably 300 times in 3 years. Then I got up, made coffee, called Miss Albright back with 3 questions, and started thinking. Here's what I knew. My mother and Gerald were already talking about the house. I'd overheard Gerald on the phone 2 days after the will reading, saying something about getting an appraisal done. And it's a seller's market in that zip code right now. He'd already been mentally spending it. My mother had texted me a link to a vacation property in Florida with a little emoji of a sun. They didn't know about the transfer on death deed. As far as they were concerned, they were co-inheritors of a house that, based on comparable sales in the neighborhood, was worth somewhere between $340,000 and $380,000. Their share, once split among all parties, would have been around $60,000 each. They had already started behaving like people who had $60,000 coming to them. Meanwhile, I owned the house outright. The deed had already transferred. My name was on it. It had been on it for 3 days. I want to be clear about something. I did not make a decision quickly. I sat with it for almost a week. I asked myself if I was being spiteful. I asked myself if I was letting anger make choices for me. I called my friend back in the city, the one who always tells me the truth even when I don't want to hear it, and I told her the whole story from the beginning. She listened all the way through. What do you actually want? She asked. And I realized I'd been so busy thinking about what was fair and what was legal and what people would think that I hadn't asked myself that simple question. What did I want? I wanted to stop living in a house where my mother's husband felt entitled to a stake because he'd found a way to get his name into a document. I wanted to stop waiting for an appraisal process and a probate timeline and a negotiation that Gerald would inevitably try to steer. I wanted to be done. I wanted to take the one solid thing my grandmother had left me and do something real with it, not watch it become a source of tension for the next 18 months. I called Miss Albright the next morning. I told her I wanted to sell. She was quiet for a second. How quickly? I want to list it within 2 weeks, I said. And I want to be under contract before my mother finds out the deed transferred to me. Another pause. That's an aggressive timeline. But not impossible. She wasn't wrong. The neighborhood had been moving fast. 3 houses on the same street had gone under contract within a week of listing in the last 6 months. Ms. Albright connected me with a real estate agent she trusted, someone who knew how to price a property to move and how to handle disclosure properly. We set a number, $365,000, slightly below peak comparable, enough to attract multiple offers fast. I did not tell my mother. I started quietly packing the things that were mine. My clothes, my books, the small things I'd accumulated over 3 years of living there. I packed carefully and I packed a little at a time so nothing looked different from the outside. I arranged for a storage unit 6 blocks away. The listing went live on a Thursday. By Saturday, we had 4 offers. The accepted offer came in at $371,000, above asking 30-day cures. buyers waiving inspection contingency because they wanted the property and they wanted it clean. They were a couple relocating from out of state, pre-approved, ready to move fast. I signed the paperwork on a Sunday afternoon at Ms. Albright's office. She handed me a pen. I used it. It took about 40 minutes. Walking out to my car afterward, I sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. The sun was hitting the windshield at an angle. The world outside looked completely ordinary. People walking dogs. A kid on a bike. I thought about my grandmother at that kitchen table, her handwriting on the document Ms. Albright had shown me, shaky but deliberate, the way she did everything in those last years, slowed down but intentional. She had thought this through. She had protected me quietly and thoroughly and without any drama at all. I started the car. I told my mother on the following Tuesday. I drove to her house. Gerald's house, really, the one they shared. And I sat at her kitchen table, which was newer and cleaner than my grandmother's and had never once felt like home to me, and I told her. I told her about the transfer on death deed. I told her when it had been filed. I told her my grandmother had done it herself, without me asking, without me knowing. I told her I had sold the property and that closing was in 3 weeks. My mother went very still. "You sold it," she said. "Yes." Without telling us. It was mine to sell. It transferred to me directly outside of probate. Gerald was never legally entitled to anything, neither were the cousins. Neither was Uncle Ray. She looked at me for a long time. Her expression went through several things in sequence. Shock. Then something that looked almost like hurt. Then something harder that I recognized as the face she made when she was about to say something Gerald had coached her to say. "This is going to devastate him," she said. I noticed she didn't say it was going to devastate her. "Mom," I said, and I kept my voice even. I gave 3 years of my life to taking care of her. I gave up my apartment. I arranged her medications and drove her to every appointment and sat with her on the nights when she didn't know where she was. I did that because I loved her, not because I was expecting something in return. But when she chose to leave me something, she had every right to do that. And I had every right to decide what to do with it. "Gerald is going to want to talk to a lawyer," she said. "He can," I said. "There's nothing to contest. The deed was executed legally. It was filed before her diagnosis progressed to the point where competency would be in question. Ms. Albright documented everything. He's welcome to try." I could see her deciding something. I watched her face settle into a kind of distance that I'd seen before. The same distance that had been appearing gradually for 4 years, every time Gerald's interests and my interests were in the same room. She chose the distance. "I think you need to leave," she said. I stood up. I picked up my keys. I walked to her front door and I opened it and I stood in the doorway for a second, which I hadn't planned to do, but something made me stop. "She loved you too," I said. "She asked about you. Even at the end, when she was confused about a lot of things, she asked where you were." I didn't have a good answer for her. I didn't wait for her response. I closed the door behind me. Gerald did contact a lawyer. The lawyer apparently told him what Miss Albright had already told me, that the transfer on death deed was airtight, that there was no grounds for a challenge, that my grandmother had been of sound mind when she executed it and had done so with proper legal counsel. I know this because my mother's sister, who has never particularly liked Gerald, and who calls me on my birthday every year without fail, told me a few weeks later. She said Gerald had been furious and had spent an entire dinner party explaining to people why what I'd done was somehow unfair, which she found entertaining. Closing day came on a Thursday, 30 days after we went under contract, almost exactly on schedule. I sat in a conference room at a title company and signed my name approximately 16 times. The buyers were there, a couple probably 10 years older than me, nervous and excited in the way people are when they're buying their first house. They had a folder with them, organized and color-coded, with tabs for different sections. I found that strangely comforting. They were going to take care of it. When it was done, the title officer handed me a copy of everything and said congratulations. The net proceeds after agent commission and closing costs and the small outstanding balance on the property taxes I'd covered that year came to just over $331,000. I deposited it into a high-yield savings account that afternoon. Then I drove to the storage unit, picked up the last of my boxes, and drove to my friend's place, where I was staying temporarily while I figured out the next part. She made dinner. Nothing fancy. Pasta, a salad, the kind of bread that comes in a paper bag from the good bakery on her street. We sat at her table and she poured 2 glasses of wine and she said, "So, what now?" And I realized I hadn't thought that far yet. For months, every single thing I'd done had been in response to something. To my grandmother's illness, to the will reading, to Gerald's voice saying gratitude isn't the same as legal entitlement, to the timeline of the sale, to closing, to all of it. I hadn't thought about what came after. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's fine," she said. "You've got time." She was right. For the first time in a long time, I had time. I had a little more than $341,000 and no lease and no obligation, and for the first time in 3 years, nothing to take care of but myself. I thought about what my grandmother had said to me once, maybe a year before she died, on one of the evenings when she was very clear and very present and sitting in her garden chair in the last of the afternoon sun. She'd been looking at the rose bushes and she'd said almost to herself, "I should have done more of what I wanted when I had the chance." I thought about that for a minute. "She was trying to tell you something," my friend said. I looked up. I hadn't realized I'd said it out loud. "Yeah," I said. "I think she was." I picked up my wine glass. Outside, the street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light came on. I was 28 years old. I had a savings account and a storage unit and no plan. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like the beginning of something instead of the end of it. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. I keep thinking about the Tuesday my grandmother let the lawyer in by herself. I was at the grocery store. I had a list she'd written in her shaky handwriting. Whole milk, the good crackers, those small mandarin oranges she liked to peel slowly while she watched the evening news. She was home alone for maybe 2 hours. And in those 2 hours, she made the most deliberate decision of her final year. She never told me, not once. For a while that bothered me. I wanted to ask her why she kept it a secret, whether she thought I couldn't handle knowing, whether she was worried I'd say something or act differently around my mother. But the more time passes, the more I think I understand she wasn't keeping a secret. She was removing a burden. She knew that if I knew I'd carry it, the weight of it, the awareness of it, the complicated guilt of having something my mother didn't have. She took that off me. She handled it herself, quietly, completely. And then she let me go on making her orange juice in the morning without knowing anything had changed. That's a kind of integrity I'm still trying to learn. Doing right by someone not because they'll see it, not because it will be acknowledged, but because it's simply the correct thing to do. She had spent a lifetime watching people make choices based on who was in the room. She made hers when no one was. And Gerald? I don't spend much energy on Gerald anymore, but I think about what he said at that kitchen table. Gratitude isn't the same as legal entitlement. And I almost want to thank him for it. Because he was right, and he meant it as a dismissal, but what he said was actually true in both directions. Gratitude wasn't what I was owed. What I had was a deed. What he had was an assumption. The difference between those two things was the difference between the whole story. There's something that happens when you stop reacting and start thinking. Not coldly. I don't mean that. I mean clearly. When I walked out of that kitchen after the will reading, I wasn't calm because I didn't care. I was calm because I needed to understand what I actually had before I said a single word. That pause, that decision to think before I spoke, to understand my position before I announced it, was probably the most important thing I did in this entire situation. Strength without clarity is just noise. And then there was the part where I had to keep going. Pack a little at a time. Arrange the storage unit. Sign the listing agreement. show up at the title company on a Thursday and sign my name 16 times with strangers watching. None of that was dramatic. None of it felt like victory in the moment. It just felt like one foot and then the other. But that's what it took. Not one big brave act, but a series of small, deliberate ones, each one building on the last. My grandmother watered those rose bushes for 30 years. Not because anyone was watching, not because she expected a reward, because she planted them and she tended them, and that was enough. I think about that a lot now. The house has new owners. The rose bushes are still there, and I'm somewhere else entirely, figuring out what comes next. Which, it turns out, is exactly where I'm supposed to be.